Hi, I'm Elisheva Liss here with Rachel Tuchman and Rachel Hercman. Thank you so much, Amudim, for inviting us once again to participate in this symposium. What we have decided to talk about for today is a sensitive but very important topic, we think very important topic, the state of how and when we talk about, and the content of how we talk about sexuality in Orthodox communities. And this really sort of spans the life cycle. So when we're talking about sex ed with regard to early childhood education, age appropriate early childhood education throughout the childhood and teen years, young adulthood, people in relationships, in marriages, as you go through different phases. And something that we see as therapists in our confidential spaces is the way that people were educated and internalized and processed the information about their bodies, about their sexuality, about the thoughts and the feelings and the phenomena and the relational pieces of it, and how that plays out in terms of mental health, in terms of adulthood, in terms of attachment, and how there have been, I think, tremendous steps of progress in our communities over the last number of years, and as far as clinicians willing to train and address and talk about the subject, as far as literature, lectures, resources, and we've been sort of on the front lines of this for a while and just kind of naming what's going on. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Elisheva Liss. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice. I also write. I have a blog and I have a book and actually a whole course on the topic of sex education. We could talk a little bit more about that later, but I want to let Rachel and Rachel introduce yourselves too. Rachel.
Which one?
Oh.
Rachel.
I have to be the boss of everything. Let's go in alphabetical order. Rachel Hercman.
Hi, I'm Rachel Hercman. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I think we also realized last year that we were each different, right? Because Rachel's an LMHC and you're an LMFT, so we got some diversity here.
Very diverse, yeah.
Yes, I have a practice, private practice in person on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, specializing in relationships, sexual health, and trauma. I'm also really passionate about utilizing social media to help bring awareness to mental health and relationship education, especially in the Jewish community. And I'm the clinical director of the Layers Project magazine, which is an online Jewish magazine for women. And we recently put out a book called Layers that profiled different Jewish women in Israel. Author is Shira Lankin-Sheps. And I'm really passionate to be here because I find that as the years go on, we are at a place now where events that maybe 10 years ago would have been unheard of or unheard of in certain circles are now pretty commonplace. I think Zoom has definitely helped that process. I find that clinically we're seeing a lot of shifts in what younger people are asking for in terms of relationship education, but I'm also seeing it in terms of people who are not necessarily considered young, but are reflecting back and seeing certain things and saying, maybe it didn't have to be that way. Maybe there were certain hurdles that I didn't have to go through. Maybe certain things didn't have to be such a rite of passage. And it's just great that we're having this conversation and having it in an informal way somewhat. And hopefully we can kind of give more language to this, besides possible solutions, but even just to give more words, because so much of this issue is about lack of words. So I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you, Rachel Tuchman.
Okay, I'm Rachel Tuchman, licensed mental health counselor. I have a private practice in the 5 towns. I also have a social media presence where, much like my colleagues here, Elisheva and Rachel, I am passionate about creating conversations, bringing awareness, breaking stigma, talking about things that, unless you're in a therapy office, you may not have the opportunity to learn about or hear about. And I understand that mental health treatment and therapy in general is not always accessible to people, and not even, some people don't necessarily need therapy at certain points in their life, but I still want that information to be accessible for people to be learning and to be introspecting and growing, challenging certain ideas that we hold, certainly as a community. And so that's why I show up there. And yes, I'm excited to be doing this again and to be kind of opening that floor to conversations that I know people want to have, but sometimes don't know how to go about starting them or feel like maybe no one is talking about this or they're not allowed. And I like that we kind of give permission here for like, yes, we're noticing this. Yes, this is on our minds. Yes, this is important to talk about. And that's usually feedback I get when we have this kind of thing, or when I talk about something on social media is like, wow, thank you so much for saying that. Like, I was wondering if anyone was thinking about that or talking about that, or I feel so much better hearing that, or it healed a part of me hearing that. And so I'm grateful for these conversations, and especially with the two of you.
Thank you. So I guess we'll kick it off with a little bit more introduction on the topic, just piggybacking off what you started to say just now, Rachel. I was doing an interview maybe a month or two ago, and someone asked me, a member of the Frum community, asked me if I get a lot of flack for trying to promote, better, clearer, more accurate sex education in the public sphere. Because we do, I think many of us share that ambivalence, on the one hand, protecting the sacredness of, the subject, but also on the other hand, wanting it to stay, in fact, sacred rather than traumatic. And therapists do see, a side of it that I think a lot of other people are not privy to. And what I told her is that, once in a while, once in a while somebody will come out and be like, well, do you really think that's appropriate? Or maybe that's not modest to, to write about or to talk about. But for every message that I receive like that, I would say I'll speak in first person, but I have a feeling you guys are going to echo the same sentiment. I get like probably 99 saying, thank you so much for talking about this. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was crazy. Thank you for telling my story. How did you know my story when I never even told it to anyone? That's kind of how I got started with it. I ended up with this specialty accidentally, and then kind of went back to train, after I realized that, all these, particular cases, having to do with sexual issues were coming my way. I'm like, okay, I guess I better get the formal training to do it well. And then, once I saw this coming, it was like people were so relieved to have a place where they could talk about it, where it was confidential, where it was culturally sensitive, where there was a background and a similarity and a familiarity of, values, of culture, of understanding halacha and the role that plays, in what's going on for a lot of people, again, individually and in relationships as children and teens, and then as you go through the adult part of the life cycle, because it's not like a one phase, sexuality is part of our humanity. I remember a number of years ago, maybe like 5, maybe 7, 8 years ago already by now, I was doing a workshop in Brooklyn for a group of college teachers. They were older than I was, and they were very from Hasidish and Yeshivish college teachers, and I gave them so much credit for coming out to this. And something I had said at the workshop was, for many of you, you're going to be the first and possibly the only place that your students are going to learn about sexuality and intimacy. And so, it's not going to be enough just to teach them the Taras HaMishpacha, the Nida laws. Like this could be like the one chance that they have to learn about how to have a pleasurable, loving, healthy, passionate, mutual, healthy relationship. And they're like nodding. And one of them turns to me and she said, Elisheva, we don't disagree with what you're saying, but I know for myself, I don't feel confident. I don't feel like I have the knowledge to share it, confidently. Like we also were only educated by one college teacher each and don't necessarily, have all the best information to give. And then the other one started nodding. And one of them turned to me and she said, would you write up a script for us, something for us to be able to use and to share? And I paused for a minute and like, whatever, like, who am I to do this, whatever. I'm like, but yeah, I'll try, I will do that. And I went home that night and I sat down on my computer and I typed like a 10-page Microsoft Word single-spaced document of like, here's what you college teachers can teach, your students who are coming with likely a very small to non-existent sex education background. And when I say that non-existent, I'm not exaggerating. There are people who learn about sex from their college teacher for the first time, and not one or two. It's a phenomenon. Not everyone. There are people who know before, but there are a lot who really, this is their first brush. And I gave it to them. And then over the years, I was offering it just for free to any college teachers who wanted. And then at a certain point I got so many requests for it, I just automated. I'm like, anyone who wants this could just have it. I didn't publish it on my blog because it is sensitive information and culturally sensitive, for an Orthodox population. But once, if you tell me you're an adult, and you want it, then you should have it. Anyway, that was sort of like my entree into, sort of writing and publishing. Then I started to blog about it on Nefesh, and the amount of feedback that I got, and I know I'm not unique this way, I know both of you probably have this as well, of just like people are so hungry and curious, and not in a voyeuristic, perverted kind of way, but in a sincere and genuine, authentic, holy way of just wanting to know, like, this is such a part of life, such a part of relationships, such a part of how we respond to our bodies, ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings. And I want to just know how to integrate this into mental health, into spiritual health, into relationships. And I'm doing a lot of talking. Do either of you want to kind of jump in here?
For sure. I mean, there were so many things I wrote down, so I was like, okay, when she's done, I'm going to say this or that. So I think there's a few pieces that come up here. I think there's when we're talking about education around, and it's not just sex, it's also about relationships, because it's also how does sex fit into the context of a relationship. And what I find to be a common challenge, and this is in all communities, I see this, is that kids are, let's say, given a certain message that there's a time and place that we will talk about or engage in sex, right? But we're not going to talk about it now. And I totally understand that. And then they get married after a very abbreviated learning period, right? If they're learning, and this is in all communities, they're taking chas and kala classes. We're talking about a very short amount of time to learn an entire new area of halacha. They don't have time to get second opinions. So sometimes the teacher's not the right fit, but they don't really have time to.
Or permission.
Right. And they already selected a partner. And I want to throw that out there as an issue, because I think there's often this assumption that when people are starting to date, they already know all about Taharas Mishpacha. And that's just not true. And I actually have seen this, that there are times where, if you're planning to keep Taharas Mishpacha and not touch your partner during Nida, so you need to be marrying someone who hopefully you feel that, hey, we can communicate in non-touch ways. And you're going to then sit on dates with people with a different mindset. You're not just going to be looking at them as, oh, are they nice? Or do all of our, list line up and all that, which is a whole other discussion that we're not going to get into. But if you know more about Taharas Mishpacha, that's going to impact the way you date. So I look at this not just from the perspective of building healthy marriages and how are we educating, but actually how is it impacting even people's perspective when they're sitting on dates and getting to know a potential partner. The other issue I find here is that we have situations where people then get married and all of a sudden everyone's telling them, your sex life is really important. It's really important. It's really important. And they're like, but why didn't anyone talk about it right before? And now we're just supposed to make this thing work that we didn't really get a lot of information on. And then there's a loneliness because, as you mentioned, in many situations, the college teacher or the chassan teacher might be the first and last time this person is asking questions to or even talking about sex. So this is where I think social media, which there's a lot of pluses and minuses, I do think that social media has kind of thrown this whole thing on its head because you have people who are seeking information and they're looking for it. And we hope that they're finding accurate information. They may not, but I do think it's wonderful that in the Jewish community, there are more addresses for people to go, literally and figuratively, to start asking questions. The fact that Rabbanim, the fact that mentors, mashpiyas, everyone is saying, like, you know what, we really need to be able to talk more about these topics and not just in a reactionary way, that we're not just going to talk about sex when there's dysfunction or when there's detriment or danger or abuse, right? Like let's talk about from a lichatchila, how would you translate lichatchila? From a,
like ideally.
It's ideal, but it's also proactive.
Proactive.
Like not just going to wait till damage control. So
and not only a pathologized way, not only like, well, we're not going to talk about sex unless there's a problem and then there's a heter to deal with it. Right. Exactly. Like that's the prophylactic piece of it. It's like, no, we could prevent a lot of the problems that arise with pre-education, with better pre-education, higher quality pre-education.
100%. 100%. But I think you touched on something common, which is sometimes it's not that adults don't want to speak to people about it. They just don't feel competent to. And I want to put that out there because there's a lot of flack off it. Like anytime I've spoken, there's always someone who raises their hand and goes, well, do you think like the schools should be doing? And I always say, hey, listen,
nope.
Let's stop blaming the schools for everything. And
It's
kids,
not their job. This is not their
kids
job.
also kids mature at different paces. So there are kids that are asking about where babies come from at age 4. There are kids that it doesn't even occur to them to ask till they may not ever ask. So the idea that we're gonna like standardize when all children learn about this and put that on the school, I just don't think is fair. But I also think a lot of parents feel like I want to talk to them about it, but I don't know how. So there's also that it's not always an avoidance thing from a place of we want to keep this silent and shameful. Sometimes it's just also a place of not feeling competent or prepared.
Yeah, in my course, I actually have a list of 10 different reasons why adults will hesitate to talk to children about, give them children and teens and even young adults about, accurate, healthy sex education. And none of them are malicious. None of them are with the intent to cause harm. But it's something that absolutely needs to be addressed. Sorry, Rachel Tuchman, you wanted to add something.
I think also when we hear sex education, I know for me at least, I know people right away start thinking about like, I have to talk to them about the act of sex. And I always say, there is so much more to sexuality than the act of the physical, right? Like man and woman or whatever it is, that sexual act. It's about consent. It's about boundaries. It's about autonomy. It's about communication. There is so much more to it that it's not just about an act of sexuality, or it's not just about body parts. There's a whole emotional, social, mental piece that, again, I think that is so important. And that's why we say sex education starts when they're young, when they're little. Like you're not teaching them these things. You're not teaching them the Taharas HaMishpacha when they're 4. You're teaching them about sharing. You're teaching them about boundaries. You're teaching them about body parts, labeling things accurately and having correct information and having conversations that are sensitive in a safe and appropriate manner. So when we say sex education, I think like it sounds so scary for people, but I guess also if we could like help people understand that there's so much more to it than just, the birds and the bees, right? That it's a more nuanced and more a deeper and a more important conversation than just one area. I think that would also help people to understand and maybe to feel a little bit less afraid. But again, I don't think that I think this is something that's often missing from the conversation is consent and boundaries and personal space and autonomy. And you're allowed to change your mind and talking about what feels good or what doesn't feel good and comfort and what's normal and what's not normal and what's normal for you versus what's normal for other people. I just think that there's a lot of secrecy and a lot of we don't talk about that, or a lot of like, I don't know how to talk about that. And so I think that if we can kind of like open up the conversation to guys, it's not just this. There's so much more. And you can start with these things that might feel more comfortable. It's those micro lessons that are pretty simple. It gets a little bit more complicated as you go on. But I think that if we give people the tools and we show them, a lot of these conversations you might already know how to have, you just didn't realize it was part of this education. I think that could be also very empowering.
100%. As you were talking, and your list is fantastic, everything that you were saying, but there were 2 pieces that I found myself wanting to like add in there, which is masturbation, self-touching, and fantasy, because I can't even, like, I've lost count over the years of how many people have had an experience of self-pleasuring, of discovering that at a young age, even a very young age, like preschool age. And we have parents who are asking like, oh, I've seen my child that they're touching themselves, and this is like a very widespread normal phenomenon. And also the concept of fantasy, like either you saw something or you heard something, or your brain imagined something, a dream, a thought, a fantasy, and they don't know where to put it, they don't know what to do with it. And so very often people have their developmental sexuality split off into this like secret, shameful, uncomfortable, I don't really know what to do with that part of myself. And then there's the part of them that like is walking the line that they're supposed to present based on their family, their community, their schooling system that they went through, and how they're supposed to present, even when they get to the point of where they might be wanting to date and have a relationship or get married. And then let's say even when they're in a relationship, or if they get married, they have their sexuality sort of split off from the rest of them. And we see this with men in certain ways, we see this with women in certain ways, and then it becomes
Elisheva, we also see, sorry to jump in, but
no, go for it.
I feel like there should be like, we should raise our hands. I feel like this happens even in the way people pursue help.
Yeah.
I find that there are people who will pursue help and they're currently in therapy,
yeah.
or they're, let's say, a couple that's in therapy, and they haven't been able to have intercourse for 2 years, and they haven't told the couples therapist. So they're sitting and talking about all these other issues in the relationship, but they haven't actually talked about the fact that they haven't been able to have intercourse, and they don't feel comfortable bringing it up. The therapist maybe didn't even ask because the couple said, we're coming in just to talk about financial strain.
Communication, right.
Right. We're having communication, right? Communication issues, right? And they weren't asked about their sex life. They're not bringing it up on their own, right? So I find that I'm often in a place of having to educate why I think sex therapy as an adjunct is not only sometimes counterproductive, I actually think that it reinforces that split of here it is,
There's marriage and
there's a parallel, and there's a parallel because
right.
they've been seeing a therapist or an individual therapist they've been seeing for years. They're really comfortable with them, but they don't feel like they could talk to them about sex, right? So I'm going to go talk to another person outside about sex. So that often can happen in a marriage. They've been married for a certain amount of time. There's a certain emotional closeness. It feels too difficult to bring it up, so they don't. Now, that doesn't mean that I think in certain situations, and I always encourage people, if you have a great relationship with your therapist, try bringing it up. See if you think that it would be helpful to talk to them about it. Great. If you have an existing secure therapeutic relationship, let's work with that, right? But I also think that there are times where people feel that they get a pretty strong message in the room with their therapist, that their therapist doesn't feel comfortable talking about that. And this is where I think mental health education comes into play, which is the fact that sexual issues, sex therapy is not a standard part of becoming a therapist. So there are many wonderful therapists out there who would love to help people with their sexual issues, but they don't want to ask about it or open that up because it feels to them like they're going into an area that they don't feel, again, that competence piece, right? Are we not asking or not talking about something because, oh, it's bad, or because we just feel incompetent or insecure to talk about it?
And by the way, you're saying so many important things, but that just to point at that last piece, and this is where the three of us talk to each other, I think one of the words that comes up in almost every single conversation is nuance, right?
Right.
Right, because the nuance is such an endangered species. And what you're saying in terms of, let's say, if you're a therapist or if you've worked with a therapist who shied away from the topic of sexuality, that might have actually been the responsible thing to do in that context. Because if you're not qualified, or you don't feel qualified or trained or competent to talk about it, there is the chance that you could do more harm than good. But that's why I think you were suggesting, Rachel, that try to get more competent, try to gain more knowledge, or consult with somebody who does have that specialty and more of that expertise. That's actually how I ended up with this specialty. I wasn't didn't set out to do it initially, but we said before, I'm an LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist. So I was, we had to take courses in, sexual dysfunction and sex therapy. And so I was trained, when you're doing an intake, you evaluate different areas of the relationship. And you always ask within the first session, how's the sexual relationship? Just tell me about how things are in the bedroom. Let's get that out there. Cause that is part of the relationship. Right. And
that's not a given that a therapist is even going to say the word sexual.
Oh, no. Totally.
Right?
And that's how I ended up with this expertise.
There are therapists who think, right, there are therapists who think they're asking about it by saying, so how often are you together?
Right.
And that's the assessment, right? What does that mean? And also, what does that mean if that's what we're using? That when you're not having sex, are you not together? Right.
But also, I find that sometimes when that question is asked, there has to be, or at least I think there has to be an explanation, why this is important, because I've seen that clients get wait, why are you that feels so personal? Why are you asking that? Does that matter? We have to be able to back that up with here's why this is important. Here's why this is a factor that we need to discuss. And there needs to be, I need to find out this information, just I want to know what's your, what kind of therapy have you been in? What's your history with therapy? It's the same. That's just as important. And I think sometimes clients will feel very whoa, why are you asking me that? And so I think any mental health providers who are watching this should really make sure you are able to explain to a client why this is important information. And you're not just being nosy, it's not you just want to know. This is actually really relevant. And to even accept that discomfort that a client might have of I don't want to, this is so weird. Why are you asking me that? That's a very common At least in my experience, it's been a very common response. Because, and again, I have a feeling it's because we're taught, like, you don't talk about that at all, you know, to the point where it's like, even in a therapist's office, it's weird if they ask you about that, you know?
Which also I would
Yeah.
add to that is that I think there's a distinction also I like to make between the interpersonal dynamic and the intrapersonal dynamic. Very often people only will reach out for help with sexual functioning when there's something that is happening or not happening with a partner. And we then skip over this other piece of, well, what's your relationship like to your sexual functioning in general, right? If somebody comes from a background where it's not okay to be vulnerable, it's not okay to enjoy pleasure, if every pleasure is considered guilty pleasure, right? If someone grows up in a family where the second you have a piece of chocolate, you then have to go for a run because it's not okay to just experience something and just appreciate it, that can translate into other things, right? The relationship to pleasure is very important. And so that idea of it's not just about, oh, how is your sex life with your partner? And if it's not going well, then reach out for help. But also people, the way they relate to it within themselves. I look at sex and sexual health as an expression of vibrancy. Very often when you talk to people about their sex life or how they feel within themselves, it really taps into how people feel in terms of feeling alive. And I would also say that when you can make a therapy space a comfortable space to talk about sex, everything else for the most part, almost I would say, like, if you could talk about sex, everything else feels like fair game. Not necessarily for the therapist to ask about, but for the client to feel more comfortable going into those places.
Yeah, yeah. I know, going back to like what you were saying before, Rachel Tuchman, about, you don't want to startle a client by starting to randomly ask about sex when they came to talk about something else. So the way that I like to do it, and again, this is true whether you're dealing with an individual, when you're dealing with a couple, or when you're dealing with a person who's in a relationship or not in a relationship, is to say, there's sort of a broader history that I like to take, that I want to get to know about you or about your relationship. So I want to get to know you cognitively, emotionally, psychologically, what's your spiritual framework, and also sexual. And you kind of throw that in there as part of like the standard of care, so it doesn't feel like they don't start to feel paranoid, like, are you calling me like sexually odd? Are you saying, like, as opposed to them feeling targeted, or like, you're intruding a space that they don't want to go. I think it's also important to keep in mind that even if they are coming, individually or as part of a relationship to talk about sex, they're still meeting us for the first time. And so there's a warm-up period. So what I like to do is say, like, I do this for a living, so I have like sort of a very clinical approach to it. I'm comfortable with it, but I understand that this is very vulnerable and personal to you. So if I ask you any questions that you're not comfortable answering yet, please tell me, like, Elisheva, I don't want to talk about that yet. Like, I don't want to go there right now. And I feel like establishing that level of safety is also modeling boundary setting, consent, the idea of letting the client have the autonomy as far as talking about this will also, sort of paradoxically make it more safe and comfortable and welcoming for them to bring it up if or when they want to. Because as much as it is important to incorporate, talking about sex, if a couple or a client will say to me, we're good sexually, or I'm good sexually, that's not really what I'm here to deal with, then I want to honor that boundary as well.
For sure. I think the same way when you go to a doctor and you're going for, you feel like you have strep, like they still might take your blood pressure, meaning like we look at it as taking your vitals. I look at
Right.
sexual health as one of your vitals, that it may or may not be related, but it certainly can affect everything else, and it can be affected by everything else. I mean, going back to what you brought up at the beginning, it just came up for me while you were talking, is that from this communal perspective, in terms of, right, I always like to say there's resolving a situation and there's repairing a system. And so the systems piece, in terms of the way we view talking about sex, the way we talk about relationships, and the sense of strain that people feel in their lives when they're having challenges with that. And, I'll give an example. So very often when Taras Mishpacha is taught, people are taught that if you keep harchakos, if you keep how would you define harchakos? Because you're the Tanakh teacher. How would you define that word?
I would say the boundary.
Harchakos are not in Tanakh.
Oh, you're right. They're not in Tanakh. Well, that's also for another discussion.
Yes. The added layers of boundaries, maybe like yeah.
Okay. So very often, and I've heard college teachers teach this, that Harchakos and the laws of Nida are a natural aphrodisiac that will make your sex life better. And where I have found there to be a lot of this bad surprise party for people is when they feel that they're keeping those laws, but it's not an aphrodisiac and there's tension and communication challenges. And I like to flip it around and say, if maybe we shouldn't be spending so much time talking about the halachas and seeing them as an aphrodisiac, and say, instead of saying, if you keep Nida, you're going to have a better sex life. I look at it like, if you don't have a good sex life, what are you counting up to? Right? So if we don't talk about what that entails for people to have a healthy sex life and for pleasure to be part of that, then the whole system will be different. The whole story is different. And I also want to throw out there, I know we're talking a lot about couples. I do want to mention that I find that there's a lot of feelings for, we have people in the Jewish community who are wonderful, marriage minded, looking for a partner, and they still haven't found a partner. And I find that for many of them, they too want to feel seen in these conversations in terms of the challenges of something not being talked about that's causing a lot of pain in their lives. And this, obviously affects couples, but it also affects a lot of single adults in our communities. And I know we've talked about this and we see this also just clinically that, it's a very difficult place, very lonely place to be. And that it, like we talk about in terms of people wanting to feel that they can move on to the next stage of life and they're a regular human being. I always say hormones don't wear yarmulkes, right? Just because someone is religious does not mean that they're not going to have the same yearnings to, be engaged sexually. So I just said a lot of things all over the place, but I'm sure something there maybe will stick.
Rachel Tuchman, did you want to add anything? I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking for you to.
I like where you were talking about, I liked everything you said, but I liked where you brought up that relationship to pleasure and like not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. And a lot of the work I do that you guys know, and some of you here may know or may not know, is I do a lot of like body image work. I do a lot of work on talking about body shame and our relationship with food in our bodies. And again, that's where I think also where sex education, like part of that is learning to trust our bodies. And again, this is married, not married, whatever it is, like we have to honor our intuitive ability to know what feels good for us. I feel like a run. I feel like a walk. I don't feel like working out. I feel like staying in bed a little bit longer. I feel like I want to stay in bed, but I know it's better for me to get up right now. I want that piece of chocolate. I don't want that piece of chocolate. We really need to teach ourselves, right? And again, like children or not children, you certainly cannot teach your children this if this is something that you do not internalize. We need to be able to allow ourselves to feel more things. And again, I know that sometimes it's not strictly a religious thing, but I find this more in, religious communities where it's kind of like, where we're like not allowed, or it's not holy, or we have to hold back, or we shouldn't be too indulgent. Indulgent is a word I hear a lot that just really makes me cringe. We have to kind of allow ourselves to feel pleasure. And yes, we also brought up that idea of masturbation and fantasy, and like that already, like I'm sure when we're saying those words, people that are watching are like, oh my, like what? Oh my God, like that's why they put the mature content warning. Like this is not something we talk about. But the reality is we have fantasies. The reality is people.
And the Gemara talks about it. It's in the Torah literature. It's talked about.
And by the way, even if you don't want to fantasize, sometimes you cannot control the fact that you are going to fantasize, right? And so when we create a lot of guilt about that, I feel so guilty that I'm fantasizing. I feel so guilty that I want to eat that bread instead of the salad. I feel guilty that I didn't run after I had the Thanksgiving feast. We're really doing, I think, a lot of damage to our body trust, our ability, like you were saying, to feel pleasure and to enjoy, to really show up fully in this world. And that's why I think that, people will ask me, like, why are you talking so much about like rejecting ideas of, rules around food and dieting and whatever, because I believe that is so much a part of like what steals our ability to show up fully in our lives. And it does impact our mental health, our physical health, our sexual health. I think about how many people have told me, and I'm sure Elisheva and Rachel, you both hear this, how people really struggle in their sex lives with their partners because of all of their body image issues, how they struggle just in their bodies in general, going on a date, showing up to the party, being around people who they, think look better. Or we really need to give ourselves permission to just kind of, like I said, like enjoy and show up as we are, and relate to ourselves in ways that feel good without the shame and without the judgment and without the trying to make up for. And again, I think that starts with that body trust and permission to talk about things, think about things, and just like, I hate the word normalizing, but normalizing just a lot of these things that are very human and natural that we've kind of made like off limits.
Well, there's that, and I also would say that I think that it's very common and it's understandable that when we're talking about a norm of not talking about something and something being like totally like no fly zone, we can't talk about sex, we don't, this is just the way it is, this is our Masora, like all these things that people might say. And I think there's often this fear that we're just going to go to this other extreme, that we're going to just have nothing in the middle, and that everyone's going to start having sex on the sidewalk, and it's just going to become like this total, which
Casualized, yeah.
yeah. And so that's where, and so I want to just acknowledge that there are things, and I think Judaism is incredible in terms of there's so many sensitivities, and I'm sure you guys have seen this also, just things in psychology, let's say, that emerge as like, oh, a new discovery or new data or new, and it's like, hi,
We've
have you
been
read
doing
the
this for years.
Torah?
Yeah.
Like, have you read any of the commentaries that we have? Because like Rashi said that on Shmos, like, so I think there's a lot of wisdom that we have. There's so much wisdom that we already have, a lot of relationship wisdom that we have in the Torah that is no chiddush. It's not a new thing that now psychology caught up to it hundreds and hundreds of years later. I do understand the mistrust or the fears around opening up conversations and rocking the boat. And I will say, I think there's also the generation gaps. I think that right now we see this a lot in therapy. You have people who are in a place where they're saying, I grew up in a house where we didn't talk about anything. I didn't see any kind of affection. I didn't see any kind of, I like to talk about emotional privilege, this concept of, we talk about racial privilege, we talk about financial privilege. I like to talk about emotional privilege and basically having spaces, people or places where you can share your emotions. And it's a privilege because not everyone has it. And I always say it's 3 H's: feeling heard, feeling held, and feeling high-fived. And held doesn't always have to be physical, just a sense that people can hold space for your emotional experience, feeling heard, and high-fived in the sense of feeling like they're people that you can celebrate your wins with, or a place where you have a team huddle. And you have people who are saying, I didn't grow up with any emotional privilege. And they're not necessarily saying that their parents are bad, they're not saying that their family's bad, but they talk about feeling like they needed more, and they're finding more now today, and dealing with kind of this friction of wanting to talk more about these things, coming from a family that doesn't, for a variety of reasons, and kind of trying to find this space of understanding that. And I like to call it being a respectful disruptor, right? That it's finding ways of saying, okay, there's something I want to shift here in patterns, but I want to also be respectful about it, and I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So I think, again, it's that finding that middle that in our society is difficult now with a lot of extremes.
Yeah, there's so many important things that you both brought up. I was like scribbling. The anhedonia piece. And I think that they really go, all the things you brought up go hand in hand. Rachel Tuchman bringing up the relationship to body and pleasure and food and intuitive sense of like what's right for me is a huge component towards building that sense of self, right? The same way we want to have self-esteem, in a psychological sense, right? And other esteem, right? Not narcissistic self-esteem that's all about me, but relational esteem where I can hold myself.
Okay, but not everyone's a narcissist, right? We're gonna, right?
Narcissistic versus narcissist, right?
There's not-
narcissist.
I feel like we have to just stop by and say that.
Right.
Because according to Instagram, everyone's a narcissist.
We're gonna need
so.
another hour to like unpack the whole obsession with narcissism, but but yeah, so there's like, you know, the sense of, you know, the attachment piece, right? This feeling of you know, you gave the example, like if you grew up in a home where you got, you know, emotional privilege, hugs, kisses, validation. Hey, do you want to talk about that? You seem sad. How come your best friend hasn't visited in a while? How was that math test you were studying for? You know, attunement and attention to a child and teen and even young adults developing psychological self and life and relationships. That kind of gives over the message thousands of times that what's going on in here and in here matters. I want to know about that. I care about that. Right. And there's, I think, like in terms of boundaries, there's extremes where people feel sometimes smothered by family of origin involvement, where like you're not entitled to privacy and like you have to, you know, you feel pressured to tell everything. And then there's the opposite where you know, over boundaried, where you're kind of like, there's no space to talk about it. There's no interest to talk about it. And I think, you know, a lot of people kind of vacillate between those things. And you see how those attachment styles play out emotionally and sexually in friendships and relationships, in forming attachments, in marriages. And then it plays out in the bedroom as well, right? Whether there's a sense of, I need more boundary, I need more space, I need more safety, I need the entitlement of like, what do you mean we're not gonna be sexual? Like if I want to, then we should, where you're my partner, right? This is supposed to happen. And navigating all of these nuances of relational, you know, bids and you know, walking towards, walking away, pursuing, distancing. So much of this is connected to not like what happens on the wedding night, but like what happens, all of the, you know, all of the interactions, the millions of interactions we have before. What you said before, Rachel Hercman, about the you know, that nida is not necessarily an aphrodisiac for everyone. You know, one of the things that I really appreciate about, I think, what's changing in terms of Torah education in the last, you know, decade or so is like less of a sell, you know, like like the Torah doesn't need us to be salespeople and to tell people why they should be wanting to do this mitzvah, why this halacha is beautiful. It's like, learn the source, like like teach me the information. Let me decide if I find it beautiful or not. Because if I'm committed to the halacha, it's like it could be beautiful for me, and that's so nice. And if it's beautiful for you, then I'm happy to hear about that. But if it's not beautiful for me, then maybe my relationship to it is I'm going to do it because like I'm connected to God and I believe in Torah and halacha. But like that added pressure to be inspired by it, I think it wasn't doing people favors. So I'm happy.
We compared it to like, imagine if we taught kashrus, like we teach nida, like you're gonna keep kosher and your body's gonna just
feel
amazing all the time.
Everything.
And when you go to Disney World and everyone's walking around with those big turkey drumsticks, you're just gonna be like, nope.
I'm sorry, that's gross.
I just want to have my whatever non-kosher food that might appeal to one. I remember the first time I saw those turkey drumsticks.
The funnel cakes, right?
No, you're gonna be like,
no, the powder, the sugar.
I have no desire. I just want to sit here and have my hot tuna sandwich that's been sitting in my knapsack. And I just feel great as it goes down, right? We don't teach kashrus that way. We don't get all flowery about it in that way. But with Taras Mishpacha, like we want to sell it. And again, I think there's so much wisdom in it. And I don't want to sound like I'm just railing against it. I just think the way it's being educated, what's happening is that you have people who get married and feel like there's something wrong with them or something wrong with their relationship, that they're not feeling this high that people are talking about. Just want to clarify, I joked before about like everyone being a narcissist, that everyone's not a narcissist. I do want to mention that like there are narcissists out there, and very often in our community when we have situations of abuse, you'll have situations where someone is being really hurt by someone who might qualify in terms of criteria of being a narcissist. So I just wanted to just add that, because I know I made light of that before, of saying, oh, social media says everyone's a narcissist. For people who really have been abused by narcissists, it's a horrific. It messes with your brain. I just want to mention that because I made light of it before.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that you said that, because you know, I was using it as an adjective, not as a noun, and that's an important distinction. Just kind of shifting to the correction, you know, so for example, when people got the education in, let's say, college classes, that like the NIDA laws are going to enhance and make your married life beautiful, and then like, let's say it doesn't, at least in the short term, they don't find that it enhances. In fact, a lot of couples report that during NIDA time they struggle, right? They're not always, often it's beautiful and they love it and that's amazing, but you know, people are going to respond in all different ways. Sometimes that results in guilt guilt, people feeling like I must be doing it wrong. And it's like, it could be that from a halachic vantage point, you're doing it totally correctly. And then we just have to sort of reshuffle the relationship dynamic around the needs of the couple, that are in a way that's going to work for you. So I think that what I was trying to say is that we want to sort of say there's two different things going on. There's our relationship to like halacha and Torah and God, and we're going to observe that in whatever way, is that person's, commitment, Masorah choice. And there's the relationship within the couple themselves. Hopefully they have a similar enough orientation towards halacha that won't be a problem for them, but they're going to, be choosing to follow it. And then like, they're going to sort of like, you have different components of your life, and then you also work that into your relationship. So, you're not going to be like, oh, I'm working too many hours and I want to spend more time with my spouse, so I'm just going to quit my job. Like, no, most people need jobs. So, you either kind of like figure out a way to get creative and make time for your relationship, or, you look for another job, but then you have to, kind of, that's a big decision and a big process. You have to replace it first. And that's also where I think we talk sometimes about the malleability of halacha and having communication with halachic authorities that sometimes can allow the, not even that the halacha changes, but like part of halacha is that it's often, person specific and, and can be adapted as needed, because it's actually the elasticity is built into the structure of it, which I think is really important. When I'm working with a couple where let's say in many cases it's a woman who's having that anhedonic relationship to sex, right? She's not enjoying, she's not feeling pleasure, she's not feeling desire, right? Very often the starting point that I want to go to is, what can you feel pleasure from, right? Is it ice cream? Is it chocolate? Is it a back rub? Is it a spa day? Like where have you, if at all, ever experienced physical pleasure? And use that as the framework, as the baseline, the starting point for kind of building up. And so often the person will tell me like, I don't really know. Like that's just not something that they've focused on before. And then we start this educational process of like, hey, hold on a second. What if we explore the idea of pleasure as a value, not as, sex is something that you owe to your partner or need to, figure out so that you can stay married, but something that like could be a resource for the relationship, and then, kind of take baby steps from there, which is why, and I think the three of us have discussed this before, I'm a big fan of the idea of pre-Kala classes. Rachel, to Hercman, you mentioned this before, that, it's almost not fair, not almost, I think it's not so fair to the Chassan and Kala teachers and to the Chassan and Kala to cram.
They're blamed for everything. I call it KTSD, college trauma stress disorder. You have people who like 30 years later, they can't remember where they parked their car or other events, but they remember exactly the way their college teacher, for them, they feel like let them down.
Yeah.
But it's but what happened in the 20 years up until that point?
Before
So
that,
dump them on the college teacher's stoop and say, teach them not just everything they didn't learn, but
make up 20 years of sex education, right? 20 years of sex, of not just non-education, because non-education is education. It's totally communicating this is taboo and this, right? There's all kinds of messaging that happens either, explicitly or subliminally. And so I really like hope and pray for a reality where people who are old enough to even consider starting to date are going to be introduced and offered. And I know that a lot of high schools and some, post-high school educational places, seminaries and yeshivas will do sort of like a very elementary.
But that's a group setting. A group setting is a totally different animal.
So that's what I was going to say, is that I
like
ask
idea, questions.
Like I've told my adult children who are not dating, like, time to take Chassan and Kala classes, right? Like one-on-one, because if you're going to start dating, you need to know what you're signing up for as far as like if you want to be in a halachic marriage. And I think there's like this kind of, like you said, the bad surprise party, like the bait and switch of like, you got engaged and you made a commitment and you're starting to plan this big party, but you don't even fully know what you actually committed to. And there have been, I've met probably a few hundred people who are like, yeah, that was like, I did not have a clue what this was going to be until after I was already engaged or even married. And that's really so hard. It's so hard for couples. And again, this is not about bashing or vilifying schools, communities, parents. I really, truly believe in my heart that the vast majority of people involved in education and parenting are really doing the best they can and want the best they can offer to their students and their children. But like you said, I happen not to be, and this is my own bias, I don't think it's the school's responsibility to give sex ed, not in the public schools, not in the private schools. I think that's the purview of families. Where families fall short, I think it's nice for the schools to kind of fill in, in certain ways. There's ninth grade biology, there's, certain, Tanakh and Mishnah, there are places that lend themselves very beautifully to incorporating to our perspectives on these things. But I think like the baseline values are going to come from the home. That has always been the case, I think. But yeah,
No, and just I guess to come full circle and wrap it up because we are out of time now. I
Yeah.
think just to what you were saying, Elisheva, about like, you know, those surprises and the bad surprise party. I'm always, I have like a one-track mind when I think about this stuff, but then I always say it goes back to building that trust in our bodies and in our realities and validation and all of that stuff that we're supposed to be giving our kids that we need for ourselves. Like, I feel that, listen, you can't be prepared for every surprise when you get married. You know, there are going to be things that come up. But if we can prepare ourselves, if we can prepare our kids, if we can do the work, either, you know, if you didn't have that background, like to go if therapy is accessible, or listen, podcasts, self-help books, those are really helpful to give yourself the tools to trust, you know what, things are hard, but I can handle this. And I don't always have to question my reality. And if I'm unsure about something, I can reach out to someone. People, my feelings and thoughts are important. I don't have to suppress them. I don't just have to tolerate this discomfort. I can get help. I think that we would have just a much healthier society, healthier marriages, healthier relationships with family members and whatever it is. But again, I think that starts with teaching from a very young age. And again, if you did not get that at a young age, it is never too late. I tell people, give it to yourself now. If you didn't get it from your parents, we can, you know, we can work through that sadness or resentment or that anger or whatever it is. We can move to acceptance, and you can say, now I am an autonomous adult and I can give this to myself with a support system. And so I think that's important, like to realize that so much of our experience in this world is tied to the trust that we have in ourselves and our perception of things. And again, not that just because I'm feeling a certain way, it's the reality. No, but again, I think that there is something to saying, hey, I'm noticing that this is hard for me, or that this is a struggle, and I want to find out if there is a way to get help for this. And I think that's important for people to do. And I do think it starts with these conversations about, you know, again, our bodies, our feelings, our relationships, the conversations we have, conversations with people that feel sensitive, but they're done in sensitive and trusting ways. It's really important that we do more of this, you know?
Yeah, so
totally.
I would just wrap it up by saying, and I just really appreciate Amudim trusting us to be able to have this conversation, and Amudim also trusting the community of being able to have this conversation, because, you know, these conversations are big, but they can also, you know, it takes courage to do it. And I just feel really lucky that we are at a place now in our community and in the mental health world and in the Jewish mental health world where we're having these conversations, and that people are reaching out and seeking to find more, not just clarity, but a sense of peace within themselves, to feel more connected, to feel more present, not just from a sexual perspective, but to be more present for who they are, for what makes them who they are, their sense of what makes them feel alive, and feeling like they can find language and find connection, find community with others who can see them and can understand them, or are trying to understand them better. So thank you again, Amudin.
Beautiful. Can I just like say a couple last words also, please? I think that when people hear a talk like this, it can be a little overwhelming, especially if you are of the variety that didn't get the education that maybe you would have liked or needed. And so I always like to offer resources. So Rachel Hercman, Rachel Tuchman, and I each have websites. We all have a tremendous amount of free content, written content, video content, some paid content as well, courses and the like. On my site, I don't know if they have, but they might. I have also a resources list of links to really wonderful books that could be used to kind of fill in the missing pieces, both from a Jewish perspective and from, you know, just a psychological, sexological perspective. So, you know, like Rachel Hercman was just saying, and Rachel Tuchman, you said as well, it's never too late. You can start getting this now, you know, at whatever stage of life you're up to. It's one of the most potential filled areas of life. Thank you so much, Rachel, and Amudim, for hosting this.
Thank you.